Welcome to the Essential Geopolitics podcast from Stratfor, a RANE Company. I'm Emily Donahue. In this podcast, the topic is the potential for a U.S. force drawdown in Korea. My guest, Rodger Baker, Senior Vice President for Strategic Analysis. Rodger, welcome.
Thank you.
With the United States beginning to draw down forces in Germany, how likely are reductions at other large overseas postings such as Japan and South Korea?
Well, this has been a question that's been asked about South Korea in particular for a while. In the early 2000s, the United States looked at reshaping the force structure in Korea, and actually ultimately in around 2004 withdrew somewhere around 12,000 troops, primarily because of the need for them in the Iraq War at the time. Last year, this issue came up again, and more recently, the South Koreans have actually been asking the United States whether the U.S. is intending to do this. We think that when we look at the confluence of the change in U.S.'s strategic posture, changes in the dynamics on the Korean Peninsula, and the nearing the end of this U.S. presidential term, that it's probably highly likely that now is going to be a moment where we could see a reduction in South Korean force structure.
What are some of the factors that play into a restructuring, then, of U.S. forces there?
Well, one of the things that we have to look at is what's the purpose of the U.S. forces in Korea? The main purpose is to deter North Korea and respond to a North Korean attack or North Korean crisis. The North Koreans have adjusted their military posture primarily to be focused on the U.S. force structure. They've shifted primarily to missiles and things of that sort. But in the general balance of forces between North Korea and South Korea, the South Koreans are now relatively capable of defending themselves. So in that sense, there is a recognition that South Korea could potentially play this role, and it doesn't necessarily need the fullness of what the U.S. forces are. Other issues that are going to play, though, include the perception. If the United States is reshaping its global posture to look at China as the primary competitor, how would reducing force structure in one part of the region look or be perceived in some of the other countries around the region? And as we saw in the German case, the United States has emphasized that the repositioning of forces and the rotational nature of forces potentially gives them more flexibility in dealing with a Russian threat. I think the same argument would likely be made in a Korean context.
If the U.S. does shift its Korea force structure, what would be the implications for broader Pacific security and competition with China?
Well, one of the things that would happen is the South Koreans would certainly need to continue their ramp up of their own national defense. And the complication that's been there between the United States, Japan, and South Korea over a very messy history, recently disputes over intelligence sharing and things of that sort, potentially those could be reduced a little bit. I think one of the other issues that would come to play is, again, how are other countries going to see this change in U.S. positioning? Does the U.S. increase maritime activity within the region, increase aviation activity in the region? And even with a shift in Korean force structure, is that shift merely a drawdown, or does it shift more to more mobile forces within the region? In that sense, it certainly plays into the way other countries are going to look and say, is the United States a reliable partner? Are they going to work very closely with them? And does this reduction weaken the U.S. capabilities to counter China and North Korea? Or does it, in fact, give the United States a little more room, but also, as we see the United States trying to do, push other countries in the region to take on more of that burden on their own? And I think that latter part would be one of the first things that we would see as a result of this.
Thank you, Rodger.
Thank you.
Rodger Baker is Senior Vice President for Strategic Analysis at Stratfor, a RANE Company. You can read more on this topic and Rodger's analysis on what will happen next with a subscription to Stratfor Worldview. That's the biggest value, keeping you apprised about what happens next. Check out the special price for podcast listeners at stratfor.com/podcast offer. That's all one word, stratfor.com/podcast offer. I'm Emily Donahue. Thanks for listening.